Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Season 2, Episode 23, Space Opera. I've talked about space opera, or at least specific space operas, before. I came close to addressing the topic directly in Episode 25 of Season 1, Strange New Worlds. That was an episode about Star Trek, which is about exploring, quote-unquote, strange new worlds, and also about books set on strange new worlds like Dune. And both of those probably qualify as space opera, but that is not the definition of space opera. So in this episode, I want to look at exactly what space opera is and where it stands in relation to science fiction as a whole. As an aside, I should also give a shout out to one book because if you search for space opera on Google, you're likely to see a novel titled Space Opera by Catherine Valente. I haven't read it, but it sounds hilarious. The story goes that aliens are unconvinced that humans are a sentient species. So, in order to prove our worth to the galactic community, Earth is forced to compete in a galactic version of the Eurovision Song Contest. It was a finalist for the Hugo Award in 2019, so it seems to have worked out well. Also, apparently Jack Vance wrote a book called Space Opera back in the 60s, but it's obscure enough that it doesn't have a Wikipedia page. So, what is space opera? It's a question that I honestly feel hasn't come up a lot in my experience, and it tends to be answered with examples. Space opera is what Star Trek is, or what Star Wars is. In fact, Star Wars may be the most literal space opera in the genre, outside of niche works like Klingon operas, since it was modeled on actual Wagnerian opera. You have the legendary hero, the scion of a great bloodline, you have him reclaiming his father's sword and later forging a new sword for himself. Those are both very Germanic motifs that you find in Wagner. You have the melodrama, the deliberate use of the hero's journey. Of course, you have the music built around leitmotifs throughout. This is an opera, about as close as you can get without singing. But even so, an example is not a definition. So let's see what people say about the definition of space opera. Wikipedia, as of this writing, defines space opera as, quote, a subgenre of science fiction that emphasizes space warfare with use of melodramatic, risk-taking space adventures, relationships, and chivalric romance, unquote. It also has some more definitions later in the article, but let's stick with that for now. TV Tropes defines space opera as, paraphrasing a bit here, works set in a spacefaring civilization where technology is ubiquitous but secondary to the story, and that usually has an epic style. Mind you, both Wikipedia and TV Tropes are user-created by people with an interest in the subject, so your mileage may vary. The Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, which I believe is a little more rigorous, defines space opera as, quote, colorful action-adventure stories of interplanetary or interstellar conflict, unquote. And I also got one professional opinion. I interviewed sci-fi historian Lisa Yazek for an upcoming episode, and she defined space opera as, quote, a story that unfolds on at least an interplanetary level, revolves around war or the threat of war, and features contact between humans and aliens, unquote. These four definitions form a pretty clear pattern. Space opera is soft sci-fi. It generally doesn't feature rigorous science, and, slightly different, the science takes a back seat to the story. It's set in space, it's right there in the name. It will almost always feature faster-than-light travel and aliens. It has an epic adventure-style plotline, and it's at least partially about space warfare. Can we find counterexamples to these rules? Of course. Dune is solidly space opera, and it pretty much has an all-human cast and mostly happens on one planet. Firefly is on both Wikipedia's and TV Tropes' lists of space operas, and it doesn't have aliens or faster-than-light travel, although it contrives a larger universe to play in via terraforming. What about that space warfare part? I found it a bit surprising that 3 of these 4 definitions mentioned war or conflict, and the 4th, from TV Tropes, hints at it with reference to an epic style. And certainly this is a common theme. There's Star Wars where, Well, it's right there in the name. Star Trek is a little more complicated. Star Trek was officially a show about exploration, as Kirk explains in the opening monologue. However, depending on which Roddenberry quote you cite, Star Trek was meant to either be a space western or a space swashbuckler. And in line with those genres, when they visited new planets, they often found themselves tangling with the local bad guys. Beyond that, even though most of the many Star Trek series never faced open war, the threat of conflict with the powerful Klingon and Romulan empires still reared its head every few episodes. So conflict was a big part of it, as I also discussed in my interview with Lisa Yasek. Are there counterexamples to this part? Are there works of space opera that are purely about space exploration and not conflict, like, say, Mission of Gravity and Solaris are? And maybe you'll see one or both of those listed as space operas, but they're not on the lists I looked at, and I don't think they really qualify. Are there Star Trek-style series involving going on adventures where they don't fight powerful empires? Ian Banks's Culture series looks like a peaceful utopia from a distance, but the actual plots tend to feature the culture's military arm, Special Circumstances. I looked down the list, and I think the one that comes closest may be The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Of course, stories with no human or alien conflict are unsurprisingly pretty rare in general, so maybe it's not that surprising a rule in retrospect. However, I should also clarify things that space opera is not. Space opera is not the same as military science fiction. Space opera is often about conflict and war, but not about the military. The Jedi are warriors of a sort, even generals in the Clone Wars, but their mission is that of a monastic order of peacekeepers. And in Star Trek, where Federation starships are structured along military lines, their role is more like that of space police or UN peacekeepers when they're fighting at all. And many space operas feature civilians who are simply caught up in the conflict. Not everyone agrees with this. You'll often see Ender's Game and Stargate on the list of space opera works, but I don't think they qualify because they're pretty clearly military. Space opera is also not hard sci-fi. It's true, your typical space opera work today is a lot more rigorous than OG Star Trek was, but a key feature of it is still that the science takes a backseat to the story. Now, that's oversimplifying. In pretty much any good story, the writing will take precedence. But when it's being seriously bounded by the rigor of the science, I think that's moving away from space opera. You'll often see The Expanse, or Larry Niven's Known Space, or even Asimov's Foundation on lists of space opera stories, but I don't think they qualify for that reason. I think hard sci-fi, even if the technology is invented like in Known Space, is kind of against the spirit of a space opera where it's very much not about the technology. I think there's a different tone, too. Stories like Foundation and Ender's Game, and also The Expanse, are what some commenters call quote-unquote serious science fiction. I don't want to overplay that moniker, but it feels like sci-fi that's sending a message in some ways. And while even the original Star Trek could get both serious and preachy at times, it was much more of a lighthearted popcorn show, for lack of a better term. I would lean against going too serious when classifying space opera. So, this tells us what space opera is and isn't, but how did it start? TV Tropes begins with an assertion that Wikipedia only toys with, but which seems appropriate. That space opera grew out of the earlier genre of planetary romance. Planetary romance is a subgenre that's focused on having adventures on an alien planet very different from Earth, where, again, the science takes a back seat to the storytelling. And you may think that sounds like just more space opera, but it's more complex than that. By today's standards, there's a lot of overlap between planetary romance and space opera. In fact, you could almost regard planetary romance as a subset of space opera, insofar as the planet in question is part of a larger galactic community. However, planetary romance is primarily defined by the action taking place on a single planet. And that doesn't always involve a larger community, especially in the early years of the genre. There are still planetary romances being produced today. James Cameron's Avatar is a pretty clear case. But we are interested in the origins here, and the earliest examples make it clear where planetary romance came from. It was a treatment of heroic fantasy and adventure stories in space. This plays into the Star Wars analogy I mentioned before, and also with another overlapping subgenre, some even consider it the same subgenre, called Sword and Planet. Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom series is pretty classic planetary romance and Sword and Planet, and you can see the fantasy tropes showing through clearly. John Carter is transported to Mars by astral projection rather than a spaceship. Other early examples even used flying carpets, where he then becomes a swashbuckling hero, defeats the forces of evil, and wins the heart of a beautiful princess. Barsoom could just as easily be a high fantasy world, and it wouldn't change much. So, early planetary romance grew out of heroic fantasy in the pulp era of the early 20th century, when people were becoming more aware of and interested in space. This is where you get your classic space heroes, the Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon types. Keep in mind, Buck Rogers was originally introduced as a freedom fighter on Earth before becoming space-centric. Now, you may recall from episode 14 of this season, when I interviewed Margaret Whitecamp, that these early sci-fi works often incorporated the tropes of westerns, with the muscular hero with his trusty ray gun journeying off to explore and quote-unquote civilize the wild frontier. But there's a piece of the puzzle I didn't know before I wrote this episode. Starting in the late 1920s, actual Western movies began to be known as horse operas, a phrase coined by silent film star William S. Hart to describe cliched, formulaic stories with these classical hero archetypes. Then, as time went on, the planetary romances grew in scope, eventually reaching grand tales of interstellar travel with stories like the Lensman series, becoming what we now know as space opera. In fact, Doc Smith, along with Lee Garvey, wrote what is often considered the first space opera, The Skylark of Space, in 1928. Meanwhile, the horse opera terminology also spread. In the late 30s, we got the term soap opera, which combined the cliché, melodramatic storylines of that genre with the soap commercials that sponsored them. Finally, the term space opera was coined in 1941 by author Wilson Tucker, probably best known for his later work, The Year of the Quiet Sun. Wilson meant it as a pejorative term for what he called the, quote, hacky, grinding, stinking, outworn spaceship yarn, unquote. The modern use of the term space opera is related, but very different in tone. Though the genre has been there all along, its name wasn't solidified in its current meaning until much later. Authors like Brian Aldiss began applying it in a more positive light to stories in the style of the old pulp era in the 60s and 70s. Before that, it was not considered something to aspire to. Its cachet was further raised by the success of Star Trek and Star Wars by the 80s, which eventually led it to become the space adventure genre we know and love today by the 1990s. The classic works of space opera are many. They begin in the pulp era with Doc Smith, The Skylark of Space, and The Lensman, soon joined by the later iterations of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, much of which I discussed way back in Season 1, Episode 6. But of course, pulp fiction was regarded as its own subgenre, and to a fair extent still is, so they weren't clearly differentiated. The real tentpoles of space opera as a genre are of course Star Trek and Star Wars, which, even if they weren't called by that name, both reimagined and popularized the tropes of space opera from the 60s into the 80s. These two series are very different from each other in some ways, as David Brin discussed in my interview with him. Luke Skywalker is a demigod, while Captain Kirk is merely very gifted and surrounded by very gifted people. But they're both larger-than-life heroes, and I can also add both white men, traveling around the galaxy, having adventures, and battling evil. Even though they have very different ways of doing it in very different circumstances, they both fit the pattern. However, a lot of the works that are considered beloved pieces of space opera today actually come from later. In 2006, David Hartwell and Catherine Kramer wrote a book about the state of the genre at the time titled The Space Opera Renaissance. And I found that interesting because that is a phrase I have been using recently, but not to refer to the same thing they were. I use the space opera renaissance to refer to today, as I'll explain in a bit. It was only in the run-up to this episode that I realized it was, once again, more complicated than that. It seems to me now that there have been two renaissances of space opera, sort of like the Disney renaissances. The first one began in the late 80s and continued through the early 2000s, with TV shows like the Star Trek sequel series Babylon 5, Firefly, Andromeda, and the Battlestar Galactica remake. This was the era when space opera came into its own as a genre that was both consciously recognized and considered positive, and as a result, these types of stories were in fashion for a decade or two. Many of these shows even became more serious about the science. See Firefly's No Sound in Space, for example. By the 2000s, space opera often combined classic adventure plots with at least a little hard sci-fi rigor, though of course the story still took precedence. The late 80s through the early 2000s were also prime years for space opera in print, with Ian Banks' Culture series, Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos, Stephen Baxter's Zeely sequence, and at the tail end, Alastair Reynolds' Revelation Space. Some of these I've talked about in detail before, while others didn't really make the cut, but all of them are pretty relevant to space opera in particular, making it clear this was an important time for it. However, by the late 2000s, this first space opera renaissance had fizzled out. Star Trek went off the air for the first time in 15 years. Battlestar Galactica and Stargate Universe lasted a bit longer, and space opera certainly didn't go away, but there wasn't nearly as much around. Hard sci-fi, and often the gritty dystopian style of sci-fi following the Hunger Games, were more in vogue at the time. This began to change a few years later, and the seeds of it may have come as early as 2011, which was the year Leviathan Wakes, the first book of the Expanse series, was published. Even though I don't consider The Expanse to be space opera, it's too hard sci-fi for my definition, I do think it inspired renewed interest in space travel in sci-fi generally, and its fame jumped greatly when the TV series premiered in 2015. I'd also note that these were the same years that SpaceX was ramping up its activity, making real-life commercial space travel look viable for the first time in decades. As I also discuss in my interview with Lisa Yazek, real-life space exploration in the past 10 years has inspired new interest in space sci-fi in its own right, much like the Apollo program did in the years of the original Star Trek. These factors have led to increasing numbers of new space operas in the past 10 years. Anne Leckie's Imperial Radich trilogy began in 2013. The English translation of The Three-Body Problem came out in 2014. Although that one I don't think space opera is even the right paradigm, given how steeped it is in Chinese culture. But from there, the Star Wars sequels started in 2015. Star Trek returned to streaming, if not to broadcast, in 2017. And two big ones from the past couple years have been To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini and Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, although the latter of those is pretty deep into hard sci-fi after a fashion. All of these I've talked about before, either on the podcast or in reviews, so you can look for more details there. Likewise, even on the amateur scene, web serial space operas have taken off in the past 5 to 10 years as well. A lot of them in places like Tumblr and Reddit, but some of them promoted to having their own websites. For example, The Death Worlders, which I kind of feel has started its own microgenre. Taken together, I consider this to be a second space opera renaissance that started in the mid-2010s, about a decade after the first one ended. And I admit I was a bit late to the party on this, or at least late in putting the pieces together. I was a bit disillusioned after Star Trek and Stargate went off the air, and the newer media coincided with my big personal project to dive into the classics of the genre. So I didn't see it for a long time. In fact, I only figured it out at the start of this year when I stopped seeing individual stories here and there, and suddenly realized, Hey, I've been seeing a lot of new space opera recently, haven't I? But it's definitely here, and it feels like it's still on the upswing, so I'm hoping it'll stay for a while. I've already talked about a lot of the books and TV shows I've mentioned here in previous episodes, and even recommended some of them. And the ones I haven't discussed are by and large also ones I haven't read. But I wanted to leave you with a recommendation, and I don't have anything more meaningful to me than this one. This is the book that helped me see the forest through the trees of the new space opera renaissance we find ourselves in. The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, which was published at the start of this era in 2014. The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet centers around a commercial ship called the Wayfarer and its newest crew member, Rosemary Harper, a human with a dark family secret who is trying to escape her past and takes a job as a file clerk on the ship. The Wayfarer is a tunneling ship, which undertakes the dangerous job of building stable, faster-than-light space lanes through the sublayer of space that would normally tear ships apart. The Wayfarer is contracted to build a tunnel to the titular Angry Planet of the Toremi, an enigmatic and volatile species that controls the strategically important galactic center. However, as momentous and disastrous as the visit to the Toremi is, the book is really about the journey. As the Wayfarer makes its trip to the planet, and each of the crew members' stories are revealed in turn. Along the way, they have to deal with space pirates, overzealous space police, and the inevitable problems of a long-haul spaceflight. The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet was self-published before being bought up by a major publisher. It was nominated for the Arthur C. Clarke Award and the British Fantasy Awards, and it was a great success as Becky Chambers' debut novel. Since then, she has published 3 not sequels but spin-off books featuring different characters in the same universe, and the separate Monk and Robot series, which was possibly the first major solarpunk book that was actually billed as such. Bottom line, I really liked this book. I thought it was a great, fresh take on the space opera genre from my perspective. Even though it involves major galactic events, it's not about the major powers involved in them, and I think that helps it. It has a lot of that Firefly vibe of a civilian ship crewed by ordinary people just trying to get by, even though they don't do it by turning to a life of crime. I also thought it was interesting how Chambers plays with expectations around diversity and identity in the book. One of the first things I noticed along these lines was that this is the first professionally published book I've seen that uses neopronouns, ze-zer, for non-binary characters. In Monk and Robot she uses singular they, but it's actually a plot point in Long Way because one of the crew members, Ohan, identifies as plural they for complicated cultural reasons, and their pronouns needed to be distinguished. There are also a lot of interesting implications about the social structure of Chambers' future hidden under the surface. For example, when Rosemary meets Jenks, she confusingly describes him as having a child's body, but it soon becomes evident that Jenks is a dwarf, who has chosen not to have his genetic disorder quote-unquote fixed. But because most people do get their genomes fixed up, and have for centuries, Rosemary has apparently never seen a dwarf before. By itself, that could be a minor point, but this idea of what modifications are and aren't used and which ones are considered acceptable comes up several times later in the book. Something else I found a little surprising is that Chambers doesn't shy away from including interspecies intimate relations in the story, even between the human Rosemary and the reptilian Syssix. This is kind of a mixed bag in space opera. Technically, Star Trek does it a lot, but all of those species are near human and can interbreed anyway. Stories like Star Wars with wildly different-looking species usually don't even consider it. Sometimes it's played for laughs, like in Futurama, but it's rare to see it played straight as sometimes controversial but generally accepted, with some parallels to real-world LGBT issues like it is here. So I guess what I'm saying is that even though it's a fun and fairly simple plot on the surface, there's a lot of interesting material underneath to sink your teeth into. Well worth the read all around, which is why The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet is my recommendation for this episode. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available wherever you happen to be listening. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter and Mastodon at SciMeetsFiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. I recently published a new short story there about artificial intelligence called The Singularity Has Encountered an Exception, so go check it out. I can also announce at this point that there are just 2 episodes remaining in this podcast. This was never intended to be a long-term thing, and in fact Season 2 has already extended it a year past my original plan. I have other projects I want to focus on, so this is a good time to draw it to a close. I may have a couple of special editions down the road, but regular uploads will end after the next 2 episodes. The first of these episodes will be a final catch-up where I go over a few notable classics of sci-fi that didn't really fit anywhere else. And then we'll wrap up with the interview with Lisa Yazek that I've been teasing, in which we discuss the future of science fiction to send the podcast off. Thanks for listening.